Commander Jake Morrison gripped the metal railing of the UES Defiance Bridge as he watched something that would change everything. Through the massive viewing window, a strange ship drifted toward Earth like a floating crystal palace. It was beautiful in a way that human ships never were. Where human vessels looked like flying weapons covered in armor and gun turrets, this alien craft seemed more like art than military hardware. The bridge crew worked quietly around him, but Jake could feel the tension. Nobody had expected first contact to happen like this. For over 100 years, humanity had been alone among the stars, building bigger guns and stronger ships because they assumed anything out there would want to kill them. Now something was actually here, and it looked nothing like the monsters they had prepared to fight. "Sir, we're getting a message from the alien ship," called out Lieutenant Beth Williams from her station. Her voice had that tight quality that meant she was trying hard to stay calm. Jake didn't blame her. This was the moment every human had wondered about since they first left Earth. "Put it through to the main display," Jake ordered. The bridge fell silent as a shimmering blue light filled the air in front of them. Slowly, the light took shape, forming the figure of something that was definitely not human. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin that looked like polished sapphire. Four arms moved with graceful precision, and its large black eyes seemed to take in everything at once. When it opened its mouth to speak, strange musical sounds came out, but the translation system quickly converted them into clear English. "Greetings to the people of Earth," the being said in a voice that sounded oddly formal. "I am Ambassador Koltar, speaking for the Galactic Coalition. We have traveled far to reach you because we need your help. There is something in the darkness between stars that threatens all life. We call them the Devourers, and they are coming to destroy everything we have built. We do not ask for much. Perhaps a few thousand of your warriors and some of your ships to aid us in this fight." Jake felt his blood turn cold. The alien was asking for help against something that could threaten entire civilizations. This wasn't a friendly visit or a trade mission. This was a desperate plea from beings who were facing extinction. Within moments of the transmission ending, Jake's communication board lit up like a Christmas tree. Every major government on Earth was trying to reach every other major government. Emergency protocols that had never been used were suddenly activated. President David Chin declared the highest level of military alert. Britain's Prime Minister Robert Davies activated wartime production systems. The European Chancellor Maria Torres began mobilizing every defense force on the continent. Ambassador Koltar watched through his ship's sensors as Earth transformed in front of his eyes. City lights that normally dimmed at night suddenly blazed brighter. Massive factory complexes that had been quiet roared to life. Ships that had been carrying tourists and cargo were being towed into military shipyards by the hundreds. The alien had never seen anything like it. In his experience, civilizations took months to organize even small military responses. They formed committees, held debates, worried about costs and politics. But these humans seemed to skip all of that and jump straight to total war preparation. The next day, Koltar met with Captain Lisa Rodriguez in a conference room aboard the Earth Defense Station. Through the windows, he could see thousands of ships being modified for combat. Civilian vessels were having weapons bolted onto their hulls. Luxury cruise ships were being turned into troop carriers. Even small personal craft were getting armor plating and missile launchers. "Ambassador, I must ask," Koltar said carefully, "what exactly are you doing? We only requested modest assistance, but your people seem to be preparing for something much larger." Captain Rodriguez looked at him with the kind of steady gaze that soldiers learned after years of hard decisions. "You said extinction-level threat, Ambassador. When humans hear those words, we don't mess around. If something out there can wipe out entire star systems, then half measures won't stop it." She gestured toward the window where sparks flew from welding operations on dozens of ships. Every human child grows up hearing stories about how dangerous the universe might be. We've been building weapons and training warriors for over a century, just in case something like this happened. You didn't just ask for help, Ambassador. You confirmed our worst fears and gave us a target to point all that preparation at. Koltar felt a chill run through his 4 arms as he watched humanity wake up like a sleeping giant. He had come seeking a small favor from an unknown species. Instead, he had awakened something that approached the concept of survival with terrifying seriousness. Admiral Robert Hayes couldn't believe what he was seeing on his screens. 3 days ago, humanity had been going about its normal business. People were watching movies, taking vacations, complaining about their jobs. Now, every number on his display showed a species that had completely transformed itself in just 72 hours. The production reports kept streaming in from across human space, each one more incredible than the last. The Luna shipyards, which normally took 6 months to build one luxury passenger liner, had just completed their 3rd military destroyer since the alien message arrived. The Mars industrial complex had converted every single factory to weapon production. Even the vacation resorts on Europa had been turned into training camps for new soldiers. Hayes rubbed his tired eyes and pulled up another report. The asteroid mining stations were working around the clock, stripping entire rocks down to nothing in their desperate hunger for raw materials. Ships that used to carry ore once a week were now making daily runs. The miners weren't even stopping to sleep properly. They were taking shifts in their suits, grabbing a few hours of rest before diving back into the rock face. "Sir, Dr. Kevin Foster is here for the morning briefing," announced his aide. Hayes nodded and gestured toward the conference room where the top military commanders were already gathering. Dr. Foster looked like he hadn't slept in days, which was probably true. As head of the Emergency Supply Division, he was responsible for making sure humanity's war machine had everything it needed. He pulled up a holographic display that made even the hardened generals in the room whistle in amazement. "Ladies and gentlemen, here's where we stand," Foster began, pointing to columns of numbers that seemed impossible. "In 3 days, we've taken 40,000 civilian ships and turned them into military vessels. Cruise ships now carry missiles instead of tourists. Cargo haulers have been fitted with armor and weapons. Even private yachts are getting gun mounts welded onto their hulls." He switched to another screen showing factory outputs. "We've got another 100,000 ships in various stages of conversion. The civilian shipyards are working so fast they're actually running out of space to park the finished vessels. Food production has been completely reorganized. Instead of 1,000 different companies making whatever they want, everything is now coordinated by the military supply network." Foster paused and looked around the room. "We've also shut down every entertainment industry on Earth and the colonies. Every movie studio, every sports league, every music company. All those workers are now building weapons or training for combat roles. The entire human economy has been converted to war production in less than 4 days." In the corner of the room, Ambassador Koltar stood watching the humans work. His tall blue form seemed to shrink a little more each time he heard these reports. His people had never seen anything like this kind of mobilization. When the coalition went to war, it took years of debate and planning. Committees had to approve every decision. Politicians argued about budgets. Military leaders had to justify every request for ships and soldiers. But these humans had simply decided that their entire civilization would become a weapon pointed at the devourers. No debates, no committees, no arguments about cost. Just immediate, total transformation. "This response seems quite extreme," Koltar said quietly to General Patricia Davis, who was studying tactical displays showing ship movements across human space. "We only asked for a small amount of help. A few thousand volunteers. Some extra ships. This appears to be far more than necessary." General Davis finally looked up from her screens, and Koltar saw something in her eyes that made him understand why humans had survived their violent homeworld. "Ambassador, you don't seem to understand how we think about survival. When you give us a choice between minimal effort and maximum effort, we choose maximum every time. Small responses get small results, and small results mean some of us die." She turned back to her displays, where thousands of red dots showed human ships moving toward the front lines. You told us these devourers eat entire star systems. That means if we don't stop them completely, they'll eventually reach Earth and every human colony. We don't fight wars to barely win, Ambassador. We fight wars to completely destroy whatever threatened us. The alien's translation device seemed to struggle with her next words, making strange clicking sounds before finally converting them to his language. Besides, we've been getting ready for something like this our whole lives. Every human grows up knowing that space is dangerous and that something out there probably wants to kill us. Parents tell their children stories about monsters in the dark between stars. Teachers explain why we build such powerful weapons and train so many soldiers. General Davis smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. For 100 years, we've been preparing for the day when something would come for us. We built weapons we hoped we'd never use. We trained for wars we hoped would never happen. Now you've shown up and told us our nightmares are real. You didn't just ask for help, Ambassador. You gave us permission to use everything we've been building and training for. Koltar watched through the window as another group of converted civilian ships launched from Earth's orbital shipyards. Each one bristled with weapons that looked far more advanced than anything the Coalition had ever seen. He was beginning to realize that his request for minimal aid had awakened something that approached warfare not as a political tool, but as an art form dedicated to the complete elimination of threats. The humans weren't just helping with the Coalition's war. They were preparing to fight their own war, with rules and intensity that made even their new allies nervous. Captain Tom Baker stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, watching the stars shift as his massive fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Coalition space. Behind him stretched the largest human military formation ever assembled, and the sight of it made his chest swell with pride and terror in equal measure. The first human expeditionary force consisted of over 50,000 ships of every size and design imaginable. Massive battleships that looked more like flying cities bristled with weapon systems that could crack moons in half. Sleek destroyers darted between the larger vessels like hunting wolves. Even the converted civilian ships had been transformed into something that would make any enemy think twice about fighting humanity. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from Coalition Command," reported his communications officer, Lieutenant James Rodriguez. "They want to know our fleet composition and capabilities." Baker nodded toward the front of his ship, where Admiral Susan Clark was coordinating with the Coalition forces. Her voice came over the ship's speakers, calm and professional despite the magnitude of what they were about to reveal. "Coalition Command, this is Admiral Clark of the Human Expeditionary Force. We're transmitting our complete fleet data now. Please review and advise on tactical coordination." Thousands of light-years away, Fleet Admiral Zentheri of the Coalition Navy sat in his command center, surrounded by holographic displays showing enemy movements and friendly positions. His species had been fighting wars for over 10,000 years, and he considered himself an expert on military matters. Nothing could have prepared him for what appeared on his screens when the human data arrived. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Zentheri read them again, then called for his tactical officers to verify the information. Weapon yields that exceeded anything the Coalition had ever built. Ship classifications that seemed designed for types of warfare the Coalition had never even considered. Energy outputs that required entire star systems to power. "How long have these humans been preparing for war?" he asked his aide, a younger officer whose face had gone pale reading the human specifications. The answer came directly from Colonel David Miller, whose command ship was broadcasting on an open channel so all Coalition forces could hear. "Admiral Zentheri, we've been building for war since the day we first looked up at the night sky and realized we weren't alone. Every human civilization has grown up assuming that space is full of things that want to kill us. Turns out we were right." Zentheri studied the human fleet composition in growing amazement. These weren't just military ships. They were weapons platforms designed by a species that had spent over a century asking themselves one question: how do we kill something bigger, stronger, and more advanced than us? The human destroyers weren't built to fight other ships in traditional space battles. They were designed to accelerate to nearly the speed of light and ram directly into enemy vessels, turning themselves into kinetic weapons that could punch through any known armor. The larger battleships carried missiles guided by artificial intelligence systems so advanced they could think and adapt faster than any biological mind. But it was the truly exotic weapons that made Xanthari's species question everything they thought they knew about warfare. Humans had built devices that could twist space and time itself, creating gravitational anomalies that would tear apart anything caught inside them. They had weapons that could destabilize the quantum structure of matter, essentially erasing targets from existence. Humans, Xanthari said slowly over the communication channel, why do your ships carry so many weapons capable of destroying entire planets? Surely such firepower is beyond what any reasonable military force would need. The answer came from Lieutenant Colonel Amy Thompson, whose ship was carrying enough destructive power to sterilize a dozen worlds. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather instead of weapons of mass destruction. Admiral, sometimes planets need to be destroyed. If the enemy is using a world as a base, or if they've infected it with something dangerous, or if they're breeding there, then the only solution is to eliminate the entire planet. Your devourers have already proven that theory correct by consuming whole star systems. Xanthari felt a chill run through his alien physiology as he realized what the humans had actually built. This wasn't a military force designed to fight wars and then return home. This was a civilization that had transformed itself into a weapon pointed at the universe itself. Every human ship was built with the assumption that normal tactics wouldn't work. They expected their enemies to be bigger, stronger, more advanced, and more numerous. So they had created weapons and strategies designed to win through sheer destructive power and absolute ruthlessness. The converted civilian ships were perhaps the most disturbing examples. Luxury cruise liners now carried experimental weapons that could ignite entire atmospheres. Cargo haulers had been fitted with devices that could collapse local spacetime around enemy fleets. Even small personal craft had been turned into flying bombs capable of taking out vessels 1,000 times their size. Your people built all of this without knowing if you would ever need it, asked another coalition commander, Admiral Kolvash, whose own species was known for their military prowess. Captain Baker answered from the Retribution's bridge, and his words made every alien in the coalition fleet understand why humans had survived their violent homeworld. Admiral, we built all of this because we assumed we would need it eventually. Every human child grows up learning that the universe is dangerous and that survival requires being more dangerous than whatever wants to kill you. He paused as another wave of human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, adding their firepower to the already overwhelming fleet. We've been preparing for cosmic-level threats since we first left Earth. We assumed that anything advanced enough to travel between stars would be advanced enough to destroy us easily. So we made sure that destroying us would cost them everything. As the full human fleet assembled in coalition space, Xanthari realized that his people had made a terrible mistake. They hadn't called for allies. They had awakened something that approached warfare as a form of absolute destruction, and now that weapon was pointed at their mutual enemy. The question was whether the Devourers would be the only ones to fear what humanity had become. The Kepler system had been a thriving hub of coalition trade and culture for over 3,000 years. Beautiful garden worlds orbited a stable yellow star, home to billions of peaceful beings who had never known real war. Now it was about to become the stage for the most brutal battle the galaxy had ever witnessed. Colonel Mark Johnson stood on the bridge of his flagship, the UES Thunderstrike, watching the Devourer fleet approach through the system like a swarm of mechanical locusts. These weren't ships in any sense that normal civilizations would understand. They were living machines that consumed everything in their path, growing larger and more dangerous with every planet they devoured. The Devourers had destroyed over 40 coalition worlds in the past year, and their strategy was always the same. They would surround a system with overwhelming numbers, systematically destroy all resistance, then slowly consume every scrap of matter until nothing remained but empty space. They had never faced an enemy that refused to follow the normal rules of warfare. All ships, this is Colonel Johnson, he broadcast to the 3,000 human vessels under his command. Remember the doctrine we've trained for our entire lives. Make them pay for every meter of space. Make them regret coming here. And if your ship is going down, take as many of them with you as possible. The human fleet dove straight into the heart of the Devourer swarm, ignoring every principle of tactical warfare that the coalition had developed over millennia. Where normal fleets would try to maintain formation and fight from a safe distance, the humans flew directly into the enemy formation like missiles seeking targets. Johnson's flagship shuddered as Devourer weapons tore through its armor, but he kept pushing deeper into their formation. When his ship's main weapons were destroyed, he ordered his crew to prepare for ramming speed. When the Devourers disabled his engines, he armed the reactor for core detonation. "Colonel, we can still evacuate to the escape pods," his tactical officer shouted over the sound of exploding systems. "Negative," Johnson replied calmly. "Look at the size of that thing." He pointed toward a Devourer construct the size of a small moon. "Our reactor detonation might actually hurt it. That's worth more than our lives." The explosion that followed when the thunderstrike rammed the massive Devourer machine was visible from 3 star systems away. The blast didn't just destroy Johnson's ship and its target. It created a chain reaction that tore apart dozens of smaller Devourer units and sent shockwaves through their entire formation. Captain Rachel Stone watched the battle unfold from her command ship, the UES Defiant, positioned at the edge of the system. She had seen human forces fight before, but never on this scale and never with this level of desperate intensity. Entire squadrons were sacrificing themselves to create tactical advantages for other human units. "Admiral, the Devourer fleet is starting to adapt to our attack patterns," she reported to Admiral Kevin Wright, who was coordinating the overall human strategy. "They're learning to counter our ramming tactics and adjusting their formations to minimize damage from our suicide runs." Wright nodded grimly. He had expected this. The Devourers weren't just mindless machines. They were learning weapons that adapted to whatever they faced. Traditional military tactics wouldn't work against them, which was exactly why humanity had developed alternatives that no sane civilization would ever consider. "Signal all units," Wright ordered his communications officer. "Implement the Scorched Galaxy Protocol. Authorization code is Omega 77. What happened next defied everything the coalition forces thought they knew about warfare. The Scorched Galaxy Protocol wasn't a battle tactic. It was a strategy of absolute destruction that treated entire star systems as expendable resources in the fight for survival. Human colonies throughout the Kepler system suddenly began broadcasting evacuation signals. But instead of fleeing to safety, the civilian populations were moving to predetermined positions. Every major city, every industrial complex, every space station had been rigged with antimatter charges powerful enough to turn planets into expanding clouds of plasma. The trap was sprung when the Devourers moved to consume what they thought were helpless human settlements. As the mechanical swarms descended on planet after planet, expecting easy meals, they instead found worlds that exploded with the force of small stars. The Devourers that survived the initial blasts found themselves caught in carefully planned ambushes as human fleets emerged from hiding spots throughout the system. Coalition Admiral Zentheri watched from his command ship as the humans turned their own colonies into weapons. "They're destroying their own worlds," he said in shock. "Their own people." "No," replied his human liaison, Commander Tyler Brooks. "They evacuated the civilians first. Those explosions are just buildings and infrastructure. We can rebuild cities. We can't bring back extinct species." But it was the follow-up tactics that truly horrified the coalition observers. Every human defeat was actually part of a larger strategy. When human ships were destroyed, their debris was left in specific patterns that would channel Devourer movements into killing zones. When human positions were overrun, they had been booby-trapped with delayed explosives that would detonate when the Devourers tried to harvest the wreckage. The humans were fighting like a species that had grown up on a world where everything tried to kill them. They used every dirty trick, every desperate strategy, every underhanded tactic that more civilized species would never consider. And it was working. Captain Stone watched as another wave of Devourer ships fell into a human trap. "They're learning that fighting us costs more than leaving us alone," she observed. "Every time they try to consume something, we make them pay a price that's higher than what they gain." The battle raged for 6 days, and when it was over, the Kepler system was a wasteland of debris and radiation. But the Devourer fleet that had arrived was completely destroyed, and for the first time in the war, the mechanical swarm had actually retreated from a battle they were winning. Admiral Wright stood on his bridge, looking out at the ruins of what had been one of the Coalition's most beautiful star systems. "Signal Coalition Command," he ordered. "Kepler system is secure. Enemy fleet eliminated. Beginning cleanup operations." The Coalition had called for allies and received something far more dangerous, a species that fought wars not to win territory or gain resources, but to completely eliminate threats to their survival. The Devourers had learned what every predator on Earth's ancient past had discovered the hard way. Sometimes the prey fights back with such ferocity that hunting them becomes more dangerous than leaving them alone. Admiral Jennifer Hayes stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, staring out at something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The final Devourer construct, a machine the size of a small planet that had consumed entire star systems, was collapsing in on itself. Reality seemed to bend and twist around it as the massive structure dissolved into quantum foam, taking with it the last remnant of a threat that had terrorized the galaxy for over a year. Around her damaged ship, the survivors of the human expeditionary force were beginning their long journey home. What had once been 50,000 vessels was now fewer than 8,000. The rest had been turned into expanding clouds of superheated plasma during the 6-month campaign that had finally ended the Devourer threat forever. Hayes looked down at the casualty reports displayed on her personal tablet, numbers that represented the price humanity had paid to save civilizations they had never even met. 15 human colonies had been completely stripped of resources to feed the war machine. Entire worlds that had taken centuries to build were now barren rocks, their populations relocated to overcrowded refugee ships. 2 billion human beings had died in the fighting, including entire families who had volunteered for suicide missions against impossible odds. The irony wasn't lost on her. Humanity had spent over a century preparing for cosmic threats, building weapons and training soldiers for wars they hoped would never come. Now that the war was over, they had proven their preparations were both necessary and insufficient. They had won, but the cost made victory feel hollow. "Admiral, we're receiving congratulations from Coalition Command," reported her communications officer, Lieutenant Brad Wilson. His voice carried the exhaustion that every survivor felt after months of constant combat. "They're calling us heroes of the galaxy." Hayes almost laughed at that. Heroes didn't usually solve problems by destroying everything in sight, including their own colonies. Heroes didn't win wars by being more terrifying than the monsters they were fighting. But humans had never really been heroes in the traditional sense. They were survivors, and survivors did whatever was necessary to keep existing. The victory celebration was being held aboard the Coalition flagship, a massive vessel that dwarfed even the largest human ships. Representatives from dozens of species had gathered to thank humanity for ending the Devourer threat. But Hayes could see the fear in their alien eyes, even as they praised human courage and sacrifice. Ambassador Coulthard, the blue-skinned diplomat who had started this entire war by asking for help, approached General Ryan Phillips near the main viewing window. The alien moved carefully, as if he were approaching a dangerous animal that might attack at any moment. "General Phillips," Coulthard said quietly, "I must admit that your species both fascinates and terrifies us. You fought a war of complete extinction against an enemy that posed no immediate threat to your own worlds. The Devourers were a problem, yet you treated them as if they were invading Earth itself." Phillips, whose own ship had been destroyed in the final battle, looked tired but unbowed. He had spent the last 6 months watching his friends and colleagues die in increasingly creative ways, all to save aliens who didn't understand why humans fought the way they did. "Ambassador, the moment you asked for our help, your war became our war," Phillips replied simply. "That's what real allies do. We don't help halfway or hold back because it's not our problem. When someone we've agreed to protect is threatened, we treat that threat like it's pointing a gun at our own children. Koltar studied the human commander for a long moment, trying to understand the mentality that had driven humanity to such extremes. His own people would never have sacrificed so much for strangers. Most coalition species would have sent a token force, fought a few battles, then negotiated some kind of peace treaty when the casualties got too high. What happens now? The alien asked. Your people have suffered terrible losses. Surely you will want to recover and rebuild before taking on any new challenges. Captain Nicole Anderson, who commanded one of the few remaining human battleships, overheard the conversation and joined them at the window. Her ship, the UES Determination, bore scars from dozens of battles and had been rebuilt so many times that only the original hull plating remained from its first construction. Now we go home and rebuild everything we lost, she said matter-of-factly. But we rebuild it stronger than before. Better weapons, tougher ships, smarter tactics. And we keep watching the stars because there's always something else coming. The Devourers weren't the first cosmic threat, and they definitely won't be the last. Anderson gestured toward the human fleet, where every surviving ship was already running deep space scans and monitoring long-range sensors. Every human child will grow up hearing stories about the Devourer War. They'll learn about the sacrifices their parents made and the prices we paid. And when the next threat shows up, they'll be even more prepared than we were. As the celebration continued around them, coalition leadership was having their own private discussions about what they had witnessed. They had called for allies in their darkest hour and received something far more dangerous than they had expected. Humanity approached warfare not as politics by other means, but as an art form dedicated to the complete and total elimination of threats to survival. The galaxy was undeniably safer now. The Devourer threat was gone forever, and dozens of coalition worlds could rebuild in peace. But many alien leaders wondered if humanity's cure had been worse than the disease. They had solved one existential threat by unleashing another, a species that viewed the entire universe as a potential battlefield and treated every conflict as a fight for survival. Admiral Hayes watched through the viewing window as the human fleet began to disperse, each ship heading back toward Earth and the human colonies. They would rebuild their destroyed worlds and replace their lost fleets. They would train new soldiers and develop even more powerful weapons. And they would wait patiently for the next call for help, or the next threat that needed to be eliminated. The other species in the galaxy would sleep better knowing the Devourers were gone. But they would also sleep less peacefully knowing that somewhere out there, humanity was preparing for the next war with the same terrifying intensity that had just saved them all. Time would tell whether their new human allies were the galaxy's salvation or its next existential threat. But one thing was certain, the universe had learned what happened when you asked humanity for help. They didn't just solve your problem. They made sure it could never threaten anyone ever again.